my goodness. Yeah, it was 45 years ago. In fact, actually, the end of this month. And I was asked to fill in as the preacher on the weekends for a pastor who had just retired. My first series was Jonah. And it took 9 weeks to go through the book of Jonah. Now, we're going to do it in about 3 hours. Actually, I still have the notes. The content wasn't too bad, but the setting was just really, really bad. I think, can I believe, do I believe these people really tolerated me or still tolerate me? But nonetheless, here we are back in Jonah. All right, now if you have your little notebook, this little thing right here, and we'll have a new one coming out, I think next week, to take care of the second half of our series in the messengers, the minor prophets. It's page 27 where you can take some notes. If you don't have a Bible, be sure to raise your hand so we can get you a Bible. We want you to know that what we're talking about today is something that is right from God's Word. And we want to understand that there is a key truth. There's key truth in God's Word. It's not just something that we casually consider. So turn to the book of Jonah. Jonah. Find the New Testament and then page back about 30 pages or so, okay? And you'll find Jonah. It's just kind of stuck in there. Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah. So Pastor Ty, knowing I'm as old as I am and have way too many stories to tell, he takes care of Obadiah, okay, last week. Obadiah it's a fascinating book, but Jonah's again, one of those softball pitches. You can just sort of hit it for a mile because the story is so incredible. And that's true of all the minor prophets, those shorter books. Typically, we've called it a messenger series. These are the messengers of the Old Testament. But perhaps we could have named it the whistleblowers. We don't like whistleblowers in our world typically because they sort of reveal something that's been going on, under the surface, and maybe there's a scam or maybe there's illegitimate financial dealings or irresponsible relationships. And a whistleblower, like the ref in a game or the ump in a game who blows a whistle, says there's a penalty and there's something you got to deal with right now. So the minor prophets, I like to think of them as whistleblowers, sort of more of a negative connotation, and yet what they're doing is they're giving us a message from God, typically. Except for Jonah. Jonah is unique among all the 12 minor prophets because he's not delivering a message from God as much as he is telling a story about his own weakness. So his life becomes the message. And that's why it's this great narrative, and typically, in Sunday school class, we're only going to cover the book of Jonah as far as the minor prophets are concerned. And it's a great story. You've got him running from God. He's going the other direction. He doesn't want to go to where God told him to go. And it's a lesson about don't talk back to God. When God says you should do something, do it. And don't think that you know more than God knows. So, as a kid, we sang this little song in Sunday school. Who did swallow Joe? Who did swallow Joe? You think we repeat things these days? Who did swallow Joe? Who did swallow Jonah? Who did swallow Jonah? Who did swallow Jonah up? Second verse. The whale did swallow Joe. That's how we'll stop right there. All right, that's enough. But nonetheless, it was drilled into our heads as kids. But we didn't tell the whole story. So kids, you're back in Calvary, kids. You learn the story of Jonah and the fish and all that kind of stuff. We're going to tell you the rest of the story today. You're getting in on something you probably never heard in Calvary Kids. There are really three characters in the story. You've got Jonah and Nineveh and God. And Nineveh was the baddest, I know that's not a word, but the baddest, most cruel, most vile city in the ancient world, probably, perhaps ever. It was at the center of the evil Assyrian Empire. Assyrian, okay, not Syrian, but Assyrian. And they pulled off horrific, gory actions toward those they defeated. Let me just give you one story, one illustration. They would take a dead body of one they had conquered and killed, stretch it on a pole so that they could easily skin it. And then they would take the skin and plaster it on a wall like a poster. You say, how do we know that? Well, I'm old enough to have remembered. No. What they did, they were so proud of their evil nature that they would take they would put carvings on large rock walls. In the archaeology world, we call them reliefs, okay? And they would depict some of these illustrations. It's sort of like a perpetual video that's available for everybody to see. So they were proud of their evil nature. But the problem was that their shadow was beginning to fall over the country of Israel. And in about 50 or 60 years, they would defeat Israel. Well, Jonah thinks he's better than the Ninevites. He thinks he knows more than God does. And when God said, Jonah, I want you to go to the Ninevites, I want you to go to the city of Nineveh, which was not a short, 20-minute airplane trip or anything like that. It was a long trip to get there. And Jonah says, well, he really doesn't respond. He just simply runs the other direction, thinking that somehow he can outrun God. So he heads to the other end of the world, perhaps the area of Spain at that time, a place called Tarshish. He gets on a ship. And the dynamics of the storm that comes, the sailors that finally throw him into the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, the great fish that God provides and swallows Jonah, and inside the fish, well, the smell must have been horrific. He repents and he says, okay, I'll go. The fish spits him out. He heads to Nineveh on the first flight out. And he places in Nineveh, so to speak, a bomb with a 40-day timer. You got 40 days, city, and you're going to be destroyed. And revival breaks out. One of the most exciting chapters in the Bible is Jonah chapter 3, which is about the revival that takes place in that great city, that evil city, from the leadership on down. I mean, you need to even put sackcloth on the animals. What I would give just to be in the middle of that kind of awakening, just to see leaders calling us to repentance. I guess that's kind of what our job is as pastors as well. And then comes chapter 4. So here's the rest of the story. Chapter 3, let's back up one verse. Chapter 3, verse 10. All right? That took care of about 8 weeks of that first sermon series back in 1977, okay? When God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he had compassion. Remember that term. He had compassion and did not bring upon them the destruction he had threatened. God diffused the 40-day timer on the bomb. Chapter 4, verse 1. Jonah was greatly displeased and became angry. He prayed to the Lord. "Oh Lord, this is not what I said when I was still at home. That's why I was so quick. Is this not what I said when I was still at home? That is why I was so quick to flee to Tarshish, and I knew that you're a gracious and compassionate God and slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. And now, O Lord, take away my life, for it's better for me to die than to live." Now, you know, by the way, if you circle, we're in a men's group, we're learning how to, kind of study the Bible a little bit. And one of the things you ought to do is circle the pronouns in that little prayer. How many times does the word I or me appear rather than the word you? You know, our prayers sometimes ought to focus on you instead of me. That was a problem. So what Jonah is doing is he's quoting a passage taken from Exodus 34. I once heard a speaker deliver a teaching time on Exodus 34, and it's become a favorite of mine ever since, because Exodus 34 is when God gave Moses the second edition of the Ten Commandments. We don't have the first edition. God only delivered the second edition. The first one was destroyed. And when Moses and God were communicating, God said, "Hey, listen, let me tell you about me." God said, "Let me tell you about me." When God says, "Let me tell you about me," listen. And he doesn't do that very often. He usually delivers his message through somebody else. But in this instance, he says, "I want to tell you about me." And here's what he writes. Now, we're going to put this on the screen. I want you to read with me. Read it with me. Now, some of you have to read faster. Some of you have to read slower. Try to do this carefully. But think about standing before God, and God is saying something, okay? So let's read these verses. There are 3 or 4 verses here, okay? Together. Here we go. "And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the 3rd and 4th generation." Exodus 34. Go back sometime, just circle those verses. So Jonah quotes that. Now, by the way, several of the prophets do, and the Bible includes those words over and over again. Let me paraphrase Jonah's prayer in the first part of chapter 4. And by the way, let's just put it this way. God, I know you're gracious. I know you're merciful. I know you're slow to get angry, and you're very kind. And because I know all these things about you, that's why I headed to Tarshish, to prevent any chance of Nineveh being spared. What I feared would happen in Nineveh is what happened exactly. And that's why I'm angry. And God, if that's how you're going to treat bad people, I might as well die. You are so unfair. You are so unjust. And if you're going to spare Nineveh, you're going to do it over my dead body. Frankly, I don't like the kind of person you are. Really, that's what Jonah was saying. And that whole struggle that we have, and look, the way this impacts our lives is really kind of obvious, but one of the things God is reminding us through the story of Jonah and Nineveh is that he really is involved with our enemies. And he's involved with those people who are outside the the family of God. He's given little indications of that over and over throughout the Old Testament, not just with the city of Nineveh. Remember when the people of Israel were coming into the promised land and they came to Jericho, and there was a Canaanite woman there who was a woman of the night, euphemism for prostitute, which is a euphemism for another word. Rahab. And God used her and loved her, an outsider. And then a little bit later, there's this woman who comes into the line of the Messiah through David, who's an outsider. Her name's Ruth. Ruth the Moabitess. And then I think actually in Calvary Kids, maybe even today, some of you are going to hear the story of Naaman, a guy whom God showed grace to, who was the chief of the Syrian secret service, a man who had leprosy, and God spared him. See, God is involved, believe it or not, in the lives of people who are our enemies. Well, we need an illustration, so God gives an illustration in the story, all right? Verse 4 of chapter 4, Jonah chapter 4, verse 4. But the Lord replied, Jonah's wanting to lose his life. By the way, I think Jonah perhaps was quoting from Elijah. Elijah got in a situation where here you have a follower of God who says, I just want to die. I just want to die. So anyway, verse 4, the Lord replied, have you any right to be angry? That's called a rhetorical question. For those of you who are in, like freshman grammar class, a rhetorical question is a question that does not need to be answered. The answer is assumed. And what is the assumed answer to that question? It's a simple answer. It has two letters. The first one is N. The second one is O. What is it? No. Okay. Do you have a right to be angry? No. So Jonah goes out, verse 5, there's no answer here. Jonah goes out, sat down at a place east of the city. He's waiting for the bomb to go off. He made himself a shelter, sat in its shade, waited to see what would happen to the city. And then the Lord God provided a vine, made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head, to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the vine. This is the happiest Jonah is in the entire book. And at dawn the next day, God provided a worm which chewed the vine. Nonetheless, chewed the vine so that it withered. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. So the heat index is high. And he wanted to die. And he said it would be better for me to die than to live. So God gives this illustration. Now, the illustration here of the vine, I like to think of it as a fast-growing catalpa tree. I don't know if you're familiar with trees, but the catalpa trees have, leaves on them like this, and then they got pods that are like 6 feet long. They're not 6 feet long, but maybe a foot long. And we had one in our yard, and the thing is constantly dropping something, and it's a mess. But it provides great shade. Oh my goodness, when the leaves are out, huge. You could make an umbrella with some of the leaves, along the way. So here's this vine, and the vine is there to answer the question. Here's the question. I want you to ponder this question. Why does God do good things for bad people? We've got a shade plant. Jonah loves the plant. He didn't plant it. He didn't water it. He didn't nurture it. But he mourns over its loss. He gets angry over its loss. And so you have God who has compassion for Nineveh. Nineveh, people who are made in the image of God. And he takes nature and flips it on its head just to get Jonah there and deliver a message of grace. Now, do you think God cares about that group of people? And the answer is yes. And God did it all. I mean, in the whole story, you've got this: God sent the storm to buffet the ship where Jonah was trying to run from God. Then God sent a fish to swallow Jonah. Then God sent a plant to provide shade, and then God sent the rootworm to take care of the plant. And then God sent an east wind to make Jonah particularly uncomfortable. And the disappointment Jonah had with God at that point is so deep. Folks, understand that we all have been disappointed with God at some time. Some of you are there now. Some of you have been there. Some of you will be there. It's because you get to the part of it becomes selfishness. You know, three times in the story of Jonah, he wants to die. One is at the hands of the sailors. Remember, he went down in the bottom of the boat during the storm and, sort of was rocked to sleep. And he's sleeping away, and the sailors are concerned about is the ship going to survive or not? And so they solicit everybody to pray for everything along the way. And Jonah says, I'm the problem, throw me overboard, fully expecting to be a human sacrifice that would then result in the stopping of the storm, the stilling of the weather, of the seas. He's willing to give up his life. And in these two instances, in chapter 4, he wants to die because he's selfish. He cannot live in a world where his personal comfort is at risk. This is going wrong, that's going wrong. You get tunnel vision. It happens to all of us. We become self-absorbed. We begin to pout, and we want to quit and go to the sidelines. And in a more graphic form, we just simply want to die. And that's what Jonah says. But God gets the last word. Verse 9, look at verse 9. God said to Jonah, do you have a right to be angry about the vine? What's the answer? No. He said, I do. Wrong answer. I'm angry enough to die, but the Lord said, you have been concerned about this vine. You didn't tend it. You didn't make it grow. It sprang up overnight. It died overnight. But Nineveh has more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and many cattle as well. Should I not be concerned about that great city? But there's a whole segment in here about anger. I mean, you could go that direction and just say, hey, how does anger work? Unmet expectations, all that kind of stuff. And we get angry. Let me tell you, anger becomes sinful when it attacks people. When the emotion of anger is righteous, it attacks the problem. But when it is sinful, it attacks people. And there's just a whole bunch here. But God really is saying, look, Jonah, you're comparing temporary shade to 120,000 people who have no moral compass. I think that's what the left and right thing here means. I'm trying to rescue Nineveh, and you're uptight about a plant. Here's the final question. I'm going to put it in my own words, or at least it's not quite my own words, but the final question right here. You care about some temporary shade. Well, what about animals? Or what about 120,000 people who don't know me, who are made in the image of God? So you're in the story. You might not have known that, but you're in the story. You're Jonah. At least you think you're Jonah. Maybe you're Nineveh. Are you willing to hug a Ninevite as a long-lost brother? In the words that we use around here, are you willing to love well? So I begin to think, okay, God, in my world, who are my Ninevites? Is it somebody who backstabbed me? Is it somebody whose relationship is broken and I think it was their fault? Is it an ex? How would you respond? Maybe it's somebody who's committed a crime against you. How would you feel? How would you respond if the justice system granted them a pardon? You know, I don't know if it's because of my age. I know it's not supposed to be that way, but I seem to get my name drawn for jury duty a lot. So you have this fascinating opportunity to walk into a room where everybody's quiet. Except last time my name was drawn for jury duty, Judy Seiler was one of the others. Between the two of us, we kept the room in stitches. Basically, it was Judy keeping it in stitches. And I'm just trying to explain, I don't know her at all. Well, on one occasion, I've never gotten to the box. I've never gotten to the jury. But I've been in the box, okay? And then the attorneys get their chance to strike 3 people from the list. Then you bring more up. I don't win that. It'd be kind of fun to at least do it once, but the first time I ask for it, it'd probably be an awful experience. I got stricken from the prosecuting attorney. Melvin Nwaya, how are you doing? Welcome back from Liberia. Whoa, Melvin, way to go. All right. Oh, my goodness. Oh, there goes a bird. Anyway, whatever. Oh, it's so good to see you, man. It has nothing to do with the jury duty. All right, let's go back to that story. I just saw you, man, hiding back there next to Martha. Anyway, he's been forever over in Liberia building stuff for Jesus, and it's pretty exciting. I got stricken. Later on, I found out by the prosecuting attorney. You know why I was stricken? They found out I was a pastor. And the prosecutor said, pastors are too forgiving. I thought, he doesn't know me. You have that. You know, where are you in the whole justice system? And I'll tell you, right now, I mean, here we are, we're being inundated by all these delightful ads for politicians. Tongue in cheek, okay, folks, please understand, a little tongue in cheek here. And so we get these, and you think, okay, right now my enemies are on the other side of the political aisle because they don't have the worldview I have. They don't have the worldview God has. Folks, our enemy does not have a face. Anybody who has a face is made in the image of God. Remember that. Even as we approach a political, I have very strong convictions about politics, and I think they're correct. But I have to be reminded every so often, like every day. Those who do not look at life like I believe you should or God does, don't deserve my mercy. I would love for a scandal to rock their world. Who are your Ninevites? You know, I just jotted down a few things that I believe keep us from showing compassion as Christians. I do want to point out, this has been a topic recently, obviously, but the word compassion found in Jonah chapter 4 and verse 2 has as its very root womb. Womb, W-O-M-B. And the word compassion is built on the love a mother expecting a child has for that child. That's the kind of compassion that we're supposed to have. And why do we resist showing compassion? Number one, we like penalty flags. We love penalty flags on the opposition. Number two, we tend to forget. Jonah forgot the lesson of the fish. God could have said, Jonah, take a look at this fish. Remember this fish. Open its mouth. Look inside. You're familiar with that. Have you lost the stink that you got when you were in the fish? How could you forget so quickly? I moved all of creation to show my grace for you, and yet you hate my grace. You don't want me to show it to the Ninevites. Number three, compassion costs. Number four, and I think this is the real problem, we have a high view of ourselves. I'm not a Ninevite. No. So it's okay if you spare me, but not them. God's grace is okay for me, but not for them. Now, at this point, I wax a bit theological. Now don't let that be a signal that you should go to sleep. Because I think there are four things we must recognize in order for us to accept God's grace. Ty mentioned it already today. That whole issue of if I'm good enough, I can sort of claw my way to heaven. We're dead. So here are the four statements. Okay, number one, if I'm going to have real grace in my life, I need to understand, first of all, I need to recognize I'm a moral rebel and I'm unclean. In my natural state, in my birthday suit, I'm a moral, spiritually speaking, I'm a moral rebel and unclean. Number two, I am spiritually impotent. I'm powerless. Number three, God's salvation is costly. Grace is costly. It may come free to us, but it's costly. And number four, God is free to grant grace whenever, however, to whomever he wants. So we've just watched the Jonah movie in the theater. And it ends like this. And we think, surely they will print an explanation, a follow-up on the screen. But it goes immediately to credits. And the lights come on. And we walk out of that theater stunned. That was no fun whatsoever. The worst use of $8 I've ever had. I like to think, how does the story really end? How did Jonah ultimately respond to God? In my Bible, the end of chapter 4 is at the end of the right-hand page. And I want to turn the page, and now it's Micah. That doesn't work. How does the story really end? And I would say this, and again, this is from a sort of a human perspective, as I understand it best. How do you think we came to hear the story of Jonah? Who do you suppose went around telling it? He did. There are details in this story that only Jonah would know, and he didn't go around saying, I want to tell you a story which will illustrate how much a fool I am. Rather, he says, I want to tell you a story so that everybody knows what a fool I once had been. And I really believe that because 800 years later, when Jesus picks up the story of Jonah, I think on 3 occasions, he says nothing about Jonah's attitude toward Nineveh. He simply says, just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, so also I will be 3 days and 3 nights in the tomb. I don't know what your ending is, but frankly, I struggle with God's justice and his compassion. And I don't see those two coming together until I'm reminded of the cross. Where God brought the wrath of himself for sin down upon God in skin, Jesus, who took our place so that I could enjoy the mercy and compassion of God. Compassion has a price. The point of the story: what concerns God should concern us. Who are those Ninevites in your world? You're going to have to be reminded of this, just like I am. So we're going to give you a reminder when you leave, a little card. It just says, compassion for ... question mark. It wouldn't hurt for you to put this in a prominent place so that you're reminded every day to finish the statement. Who, what do I need to show compassion for? Because God does. Lord, who are we to decide who gets grace and who doesn't? Because of previous behavior, because of current direction, because of worldly moral compasses, whatever it might be. God, we long to help everybody understand that the justice of God and the compassion of God meet together at the cross, where the price was paid so that we might enjoy that grace, that compassion, that mercy, that salvation. God, help us just to identify perhaps the most vile, baddest enemies in our world and understand that indeed, if you're concerned for them, we also should be. Thank you for the lesson from Jonah. In Jesus' name, amen. Would you stand, please?